My parents told my younger brother to take my house because, apparently, being single means I don't need it. I'm in my early 30s and don't have a family, while my brother, who's 29, already has 4 kids. He started young, having his first at 22, then another the next year, a third 2 years later, and the youngest just a few months ago. His wife and I have never seen eye to eye. She has this way of acting smug and condescending just to provoke me, and if I push back, she flips the switch and becomes this over-the-top victim, crying on cue like an Oscar-worthy performance. It works, too. My parents and brother eat it up, even though they know exactly how manipulative she can be. They just don't care. I'll admit she's attractive, but her attitude is so toxic that it cancels everything out. She also refuses to work despite having a degree, and since my mom helps out with the kids all day, my brother is the sole breadwinner. This means they can't afford to live anywhere other than my parents' house, which is a cramped 3-bedroom place built in the 1960s. Privacy isn't really a thing there with all of them packed under one roof. Growing up, my brother was clearly the favorite. He's 3 years younger than me, but he acted like he was better in every way. I was always punished if I dared to stand up to him. It was obvious my parents cared for him more. They gave him the better of everything unless someone else was watching. Extended family occasionally called them out on it, which led to my parents packing us up and moving 150 miles away just to avoid the scrutiny. After that, we only saw those relatives during the holidays because the 3-hour drive wasn't worth it to them. My brother was awful, physically abusive, relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she dumped me, and laughed at anything that went wrong in my life. Whenever I complained, my parents would just tell me to get over it. They only treated me fairly when they had an audience to impress, like on birthdays or Christmas when nosy relatives were around. Watching them try to pretend they cared about equality was almost funny. Almost. When I turned 18 and moved out, my parents were visibly relieved. It meant they didn't have to provide for me anymore. I wasn't even done with high school yet, but crashing on friends' couches was better than staying with them. Since then, I've kept my distance. They didn't even bother showing up for my high school graduation. At that point, I honestly stopped caring much about keeping in touch. I'd only see my parents and brother during the holidays, just like the rest of the family. Then, the pandemic hit in 2020, and everything fell apart for me. I lost my job, and with my roommate also out of work, we couldn't afford to renew the lease on our 2-bedroom condo. It was a place I really loved, but unemployment money wasn't enough to cover the rent. As the lease ran out, my roommate moved back in with relatives, leaving me to figure out what to do. I ended up selling most of my belongings because I had no other choice. I needed to downsize drastically or face homelessness. Looking back, I never should have rented a place that was so expensive, but I got caught up in the appeal of living large. When reality hit hard, I realized I should have been living somewhere more affordable and saving money for emergencies. I came up with a plan, though. I've always loved trucks, so I owned one, and I managed to find a camper in decent condition for just $1,000. I put it on my truck, figuring I could live out of it temporarily. But what I thought would be a short-term solution ended up stretching far longer than I'd ever expected. Initially, I hoped to park the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family were still living. But when I asked, my parents flat out refused. They claimed their house was full and reminded me that we hadn't exactly been on good terms for years. The only offer they made was to let me park there if I paid them a fee that was equivalent to the cost of renting an apartment in the area. It was absurd. I was unemployed and trying to save what little unemployment money I had, so there was no way I could agree to that. To make matters worse, my parents didn't hide their disdain. They called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave. My brother joined in, mocking me alongside his wife, calling me a homeless bum, and laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. With nowhere else to go, I ended up parking my truck and camper in a store parking lot that first night. I was terrified someone might try to break in, and as a result, I barely got any sleep. Unfortunately, I didn't have many options. Any relatives who might have been able to help were too far away, and most of my friends lived in apartments and couldn't accommodate me. I was also deeply attached to the area I was in and didn't want to leave. To make things work, I forwarded my mail to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could still receive it. Finding a stable, safe place to park my camper proved to be an ongoing challenge. I started searching for a job similar to my old one, but it took months of living a nomadic life in my camper before I found anything. During that time, I had to deal with all kinds of challenges. There were beggars and drug addicts around some of the areas I parked, and occasionally, people would demand I leave, calling my camper an eyesore. Once, a guy claimed he was from an HOA and insisted I move. The thing is, I wasn't even parked on a residential street. When I questioned what HOA he was talking about, he got aggressive and threatened me. Not wanting to escalate the situation, I just moved on to avoid the hassle. To keep my camper batteries charged, I had to get creative. I used a long extension cord to plug into outside outlets wherever I could find one, usually random buildings while parked on the street. I know it wasn't the most ethical thing to do, but I needed electricity to keep my refrigerator running. For my phone, I had a small solar power bank, but I didn't own a generator. Besides, generators are loud and need fuel, so this was the best I could manage. After months of living this way, I finally landed a new job. It wasn't in retail, which I was determined to avoid after my college days working those types of jobs. I'd nearly given up on that promise, though, as desperation set in. Even while receiving unemployment benefits, I had no stable place to stay, and I didn't want to be jobless when the money ran out. On top of that, I was bored out of my mind most of the time. My daily routine consisted of reading, watching movies on a tiny portable DVD player, using my phone or laptop, and keeping track of where I could park or find public bathrooms to use. I'll admit, I envied the public bathhouses they have in Japan. We could really use something like that here. When I eventually found a job, I moved to a neighboring city. I ended up essentially living in my truck camper, parking in the back lot of the warehouse where I worked. There were old employee parking spaces back there that no one else seemed to use because they were so far out of the way they'd been practically forgotten. Oddly enough, the company owner liked this arrangement. I made myself available for any shift they needed me to cover, as long as I could get enough sleep. My boss even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the parking spaces so I could drive around without hauling it everywhere. I'm not sure if this setup was entirely legal, but no one ever questioned it the entire time I lived back there. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with too many trespassers. On the rare occasions there were any, the security guards handled them quickly. Since I was living right there, I was pretty much on call all the time. I ended up working nearly every day of the week, which helped me save money. My boss allowed me to plug the camper into the building for power and water, and in exchange, I paid a small rent by working for free on Sundays when the office was empty except for the janitor and the security guard. For showers, I relied on a friend's apartment or my local gym, since the camper only had a portable toilet and no shower. I avoided using the camper's toilet unless absolutely necessary because emptying it is one of the most disgusting tasks imaginable. I also had a key to the warehouse, so I could use the bathroom there at any time. I got to know the night security guard well, and over time, we became good friends. He's still one of my closest buddies. Winters in the camper were manageable with a small electric heater, but summers were brutal. The camper didn't have air conditioning, so I ended up buying a used portable AC unit just to survive the heat. Despite the challenges, the setup worked well enough for me to make plenty of overtime pay and learn some useful skills from my coworkers. By the middle of this year, I was promoted to a supervisor position, which came with a better salary than I'd had at my old job. That's when I decided it was time to get a house. Losing the condo had been a wake-up call. It made me realize I needed something more stable and permanent. I started looking at places close to work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home just 2 miles away. It came with a small yard and was listed for a decent price. I managed to negotiate it down by $10,000 and used nearly all my savings for the down payment. Thankfully, I got approved for a home loan, and finally, I didn't have to live in the camper anymore. The house was perfect for me. It even had enough space in the backyard for me to park my truck and set up the camper as its own little building, just in case I ever needed it again. Once I was fully settled in, I made the mistake of posting about my new home on Facebook. That's when everything went downhill. A few weeks later, my parents, my brother, and his whole family showed up unannounced, demanding a tour of my house. I didn't even give them my address, so to this day, I have no idea how they found out where I lived. None of my friends have admitted to spilling the beans, and no other family members had visited me before this. Part of me wonders if they stalked me at work and followed me home, which honestly wouldn't surprise me. When I opened the door, they practically barged in like they owned the place, acting like nosy tourists exploring a new attraction. My brother's wife kept flashing me this smug grin that gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't realize why until later, and when I did, I was furious. My parents kept commenting about how much extra space I had and saying it was too much for someone like me who didn't have a wife or kids. My brother chimed in, pointing out how my house was bigger than our parents and closer to his job. It felt like they were circling me like vultures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Red flags were popping up all over the place. At one point, my brother pulled me aside and asked to talk in private. Everyone else conveniently left the room and gathered on the front porch, which instantly made me suspicious. It was clear they planned something. Once we were alone, Dan started his pitch. He told me the house was too much for someone like me to live in alone and suggested I let him move in with his family since his wife was pregnant with their fourth child. He pointed out that my house was much closer to his job and said I could just live in the camper outside while they took over the main house. Not once did he mention offering rent, which was laughable because Dan has a decent-paying job. Then he started rambling about how there would need to be changes, like curfews, and how I wouldn't be allowed to come into the house whenever I wanted unless I gave them prior notice. If this wasn't my own brother talking, I'd have thought he'd completely lost it. But honestly, Dan had been this way for years, thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the universe. I tried to interject, but Dan kept talking over me, as if my opinion didn't matter. There was absolutely no chance I'd rent my house, or any part of it to him. Maybe I'd consider renting to someone else someday to help pay off the mortgage faster, but certainly not to Dan or his insufferable wife. I'd seen videos online about situations exactly like this, and I always thought, wow, what kind of entitled lunatics would try something like that? I never imagined I'd actually live it myself, but my parents, my brother, and his wife checked every box for narcissistic, entitled craziness. So, I pulled out my phone and discreetly started recording while Dan went on about why he needed my house. He didn't even notice or care, waving his arms around and listing every reason under the sun why they should move in. Then, he shifted to acting like the decision was already made, reaching out his hand as if to shake on it. That's when I'd had enough. I stood my ground, raised my voice and said, "Hell no," loud enough to make Dan stumble back in surprise. I almost never raised my voice to him growing up because our parents would punish me for it. But this was my house, not theirs. Here, I could be as firm as I wanted. I stood up and told him, clear as day, that my house was not up for grabs. Acting like I'd just roll over and let them take it wasn't going to work. I bought this house for myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept having more kids and still had to live with our parents because he couldn't afford to move out. Dan got right up in my face, close enough to be intimidating without actually touching me, and said I didn't deserve the house. He claimed he needed a better place for his family to live. I couldn't help but laugh in his face and tell him that was absolute nonsense. I'd worked my ass off to buy this house. Of course I deserved it. That's when Dan started yelling. Dan told me that since I didn't have a wife or kids, I didn't need all the space in my house, so I might as well give it to him. I shot back that I wasn't giving him anything, especially since he hadn't even offered to pay rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be stuck covering the entire mortgage on my own house while not even being able to live there. Then Dan said something that made my blood boil. He claimed he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and, apparently, our parents had already decided I was going to let him have the house. He acted like their word was final, as if they had the authority to give away my home. I yelled back that they had no right or power to make that decision. At that point, things escalated. Dan stormed back into the house, dragging my parents and his wife along with him, and they surrounded me like they were staging some kind of intervention. The argument turned into a shouting match, and from that point on, all I kept hearing was the same infuriating line over and over. Just do it for Dan. During the fight, I told them straight up that they didn't have any say in my life or my property, and if they didn't leave immediately, I'd call the cops. That's when Sil, my brother's wife, screamed louder than anyone else, wailing about how she was pregnant again and how I couldn't do this to her. I told her exactly what I thought. I hadn't done anything to her. She just assumed she could take from me without asking, like I owed her something. I told her I had no obligation to her or her family and that she would never live in my house. Then I went one step further. I called her a stuck-up brat who'd never had any respect for me, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. That was the breaking point for her. She flew into a rage and attacked me, landing a solid hit to my face before trying to swing again. My brother had to hold her back while she kicked and screamed, demanding that he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. Thankfully, my phone had been recording the entire time. I held it up and warned them all that I'd call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents finally told Dan it was time to go, but not before my mother looked at me and said, "You have a week to come to your senses." I snapped back, "I won't, and don't come back." Before they left, I turned to Sil and told her the video was proof of what she'd done, and if she tried anything else, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me, then stormed out of the house, bawling with her face in her hands. My mother was the last to leave, still trying to guilt me, saying, "You'd better do this for Dan and Sil." My final words to her were simple, "I won't." As soon as they were gone, I went straight to social media and posted the full story for the rest of the family to see. I knew the first thing they'd do when they got home was twist the situation to make me look like the villain, so I made sure to get ahead of them. The post spread like wildfire. I don't have it up anymore because I later deleted it and set my profile to private, but at the time, it was crucial. I even had video evidence to back up everything I said about what had happened. Being proactive worked in my favor because a fair number of family members took my side right away. It seemed like my parents, Dan, and Sil were all gearing up to post their version of events, but I beat them to the punch. By the time they could respond, it was too late, and they didn't even bother trying to spin the story with outright lies. They had a handful of supporters, some flying monkeys who always defended their entitled behavior, but most of the family knew exactly what kind of people they were. Nobody was surprised by what happened, and many even admitted they saw it coming. One person, whose identity I still don't know, called me just a rant. They accused me of being a horrible brother and said I needed to make way for a real family man. I didn't waste my time arguing. I just hung up and blocked the number. That was the end of that, and thankfully, it didn't happen again. A week later, right on schedule, my parents showed up on my front porch with Dan in tow. They rang the doorbell like maniacs and pounded on the door nonstop until I finally answered. I only opened the door a crack, but they immediately tried to push their way in again. Luckily, I had installed a couple of latch chains on the door and braced myself against it, so their attempt didn't get very far. My father and Dan started demanding I let them in, but I told them I had a camera recording everything and warned them I'd call the police if they tried to force their way in. That seemed to calm them down a bit, and then my mother took over, putting on her best fake smile and syrupy sweet voice. She asked, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world, if I was ready to let my brother move in. I didn't hold back. I told her, and the rest of them, to get lost and never come back. My mother immediately turned on the waterworks, crying dramatically and asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan, because he was my beloved brother. That made me laugh out loud. I told her bluntly that I didn't love Dan as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years, and their great parenting, in particular, had encouraged him to do it. I called them out as terrible parents and told Dan he was a terrible brother. Then I told them all to leave immediately, or I'd call the police. To my surprise, they didn't put up much of a fight. They left after some more loud crying from my mother and a few nasty looks from the rest of them. If anything, the way they left so easily felt suspicious. A part of me thought the whole ordeal was finally over, but in hindsight, I should have been more cautious. Because, of course, they had another stupid plan. When I got home later, that Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were there, unloading their stuff. The moment he saw me, he gave me this smug grin and waved like everything was fine. I was absolutely furious. I marched up to them and told them to stop immediately, but Sil, in her usual fake, condescending tone, just smirked and said, "Like it or not, we're moving in." Then, tilting her head and puckering her lips in the most irritating way, she added, "It's okay because Mommy said so, and you should always listen to what Mommy tells you." Hearing those words, paired with her self-satisfied expression, made my blood boil. I was seething with rage, but instead of losing my temper, I locked myself in my truck and called the cops. As soon as Sil realized what I was doing, she ran over and started banging on my window, screaming at me to stop. She wailed about how she and Dan needed the house and then threw in her classic line, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I snapped back, "Because it's my damn house, not his." That's when she threatened to key the side of my truck if I didn't hang up the phone. Thankfully, the 911 operator heard her threat loud and clear, as I'd left the window cracked. I told Sil if she so much as scratched my truck, I'd sue her, and that seemed to be enough to make her back off. When the police arrived, Dan and Sil had locked themselves inside my house with their kids. I explained the situation to the officers, showing them my driver's license with my current address to prove the house was mine. When we got to the front door, I noticed they had changed the lock. My old lock was lying on the porch, and the center of it had been drilled out. Next to it was a drill and a full Harbor Freight drill bit set, sitting there like the world's dumbest confession. I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the officers a full rundown of everything that had happened leading up to this point. At some point after I got home, Dan must have called our parents, because they showed up while I was explaining things to the cops. Of course, my parents immediately started lying, claiming I'd agreed to rent the house to Dan and his family. I calmly told them that was a blatant lie and easy to disprove. That's when Dan and Sil came out of the house, looking all smug, and handed the cops some papers. They had actually gone so far as to print out a fake rental agreement. The problem? The signature wasn't mine. It didn't even resemble my handwriting. Clearly, none of them had ever seen my actual signature, which made their forgery laughably bad. I pointed this out to the cops and said, "This is blatant fraud. If you investigate, it'll take 2 seconds to figure that out. And by the way, I don't think Dan will enjoy how jail or court might affect his job, his only way of providing for his family." I didn't stop there. I told them I'd get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. And if they kept pushing, I'd also call CPS for good measure. Dan went pale, clearly realizing how much trouble they were in. My mom, on the other hand, doubled down. She got between us and insisted that I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper so they could finally have a proper family home. That was the last straw. I yelled back, "If you think it's such a great idea, why don't you do it for Dan? Let him have your house instead." The cops quickly separated us, and I told the officers I wanted them all out of my house immediately or I'd press charges. I shouted that they had drilled out my front door lock, forged a lease, and that I had video evidence of Sil physically attacking me, all of which were serious crimes. I made it crystal clear that if they didn't leave immediately, I wouldn't hesitate to press charges for everything they'd done. The only reason I hadn't already was because I didn't want Dan's kids to suffer for his and Sil's actions. But I told them this was their one and only chance to get out. Something must have finally clicked for my parents when they realized they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother sighed in defeat and said she'd put an end to the whole ordeal. She walked over to Sil and whispered something to her while my father had a quiet word with Dan. Suddenly, Sil burst into tears, dramatically ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny shreds and tossing them into the air like confetti. One of the officers immediately stepped in and told her to pick up every single piece or he'd cite her for littering. Both cops looked exhausted by this point, wearing the kind of expressions that screamed, "I don't get paid enough for this." Dan reluctantly told his kids to start loading their things back into the moving truck. The kids were bawling, with the oldest sobbing about how he wouldn't get his own room now. Meanwhile, Sil and Dan regrouped their family for one last pathetic attempt to guilt me. It was so staged that I almost laughed. They had clearly rehearsed the whole act. All the kids gave me the same pleading look, complete with quivering lips. Sil rubbed her pregnant belly and tilted her head, trying to look like a sad puppy, and Dan pulled his most pitiful face, saying, "Please don't do this. We need to live here." But I didn't budge. I told them to keep packing and leave. That's when the waterworks kicked into overdrive. The kids wailed louder, Sil sobbed hysterically, and Dan lost it, yelling, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I couldn't help myself. I burst out laughing like a lunatic. You call this sharing? I shot back. You're trying to take, not share. And no amount of crying or guilt trips is going to make me let you move in. You're not my brother anymore, Dan. You're just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants, just like when we were kids. Dan's response was to start dropping F-bombs at me left and right, until one of the cops stepped in and told him to cool it or risk being cuffed, whether or not I press charges. That shut him up quickly, and his expression turned into a mix of anger and fear as he bit his lip to keep quiet. I asked the cops if they could stay until everyone was gone, and they assured me they weren't leaving until everything was fully resolved. For whatever reason, 2 more officers arrived shortly after, bringing the total to 4. That seemed to light a fire under my parents, Dan and Sil, who finally started taking things seriously and packing up faster. Before they could leave, I demanded Dan hand over the keys to the new lock he'd installed on my door. At first, he refused, but after some pressure from the cops, he grudgingly pulled the keys out. Instead of giving them to me, though, he chucked them down the street and into a storm drain, sneering, "Go get them yourself?" One of the officers wasn't having it. He scolded Dan and ordered him to retrieve the keys. Dan had to lift the grate off the drain and dig around to get them, getting himself filthy in the process. When he finally had the keys, he stomped back over, muttering under his breath, and slammed them into my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother, as dramatic as ever, declared that I'd be disowned for this, as if that was supposed to scare me. Instead, I laughed and told her, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any more holidays with you guys, where I always get treated like crap anyway because Dan is your obvious favorite. You treated me so horribly growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him a damn thing. So, why don't you all do what you always told me to do when I was mistreated? Suck it up." The look on their faces was priceless. My parents were absolutely stunned, and even the cops seemed to be looking at them with a mix of judgment and disgust. I swear, if you ever need to put entitled, toxic parents like mine in their place, do it in front of cops. They won't try anything too stupid with law enforcement right there. My mother started crying and walked away. My father just stood there glaring at me like he wanted to punch me, and Dan held his kids, looking utterly defeated. Meanwhile, Sil was off in the front yard, throwing yet another tantrum. Eventually, they all lined up to carry boxes out of my house. Luckily, nothing had been unpacked yet, so the process was quick. As they worked, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late and that I could still do it for Dan. She must have repeated that line a dozen times, each time trying to bargain with me in a different way. First, she offered that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she suggested I move back in with them and let Dan rent the house so I wouldn't have to share the space. I wasn't having any of it. I told her to shut up and keep packing because I didn't want Dan or his family around. I didn't want their money, and I certainly didn't want to live with my parents ever again after how they treated me as a kid. Making a deal with you, I said, would be like making a deal with the devil. Hearing that, Sil lost it again. She threw a box onto the ground, then sat down in the yard for a full-blown pity party, sulking and scowling because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She stayed there looking furious while everyone else finished packing. When it was finally time to leave, she didn't even want to get up. Once everything was loaded back into the moving truck, I decided I wasn't done. Before they left, I gave my parents one last piece of my mind. With the cops still standing there, they couldn't do much but stand there and take it for once. I laid into them, calling out all the crap they put me through as a kid. I didn't hold back. I even pointed out how they couldn't do something as simple as letting me park my camper at their place when I needed help. I reminded my parents, right in front of the cops, how they let Dan and Sil ridicule me and call me a bum when I was homeless and just trying to get back on my feet. Well, I said, who's the bum now? I laid it out plainly. They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could live in it for free, but when I needed a place to park my camper, they tried to gouge me for rent I couldn't afford. Knowing full well I was out of a job, the officers exchanged judgmental glances as I went on, so I turned back to my parents and hit them with the big question. What did I ever do, other than be born, to deserve being treated so badly by you? I didn't hold back, asking why, every time I achieved even a small amount of success in my life, They felt entitled to snatch it away and hand it over to their favorite child. I told them, I bought this house with my own hard-earned money. I don't owe you anything, and I won't be asking you for anything ever again. It's obvious I'll never be more than a doormat or a cash cow to you. They had no answers, just blank, stunned expressions. My parents stood there like fish out of water, completely silent. So, I kept going. I asked them what on earth made them think they were good parents after everything they'd put me through. My father turned beet red, but this time it wasn't from anger. It was pure embarrassment. My mother broke down crying and admitted she was a horrible person. Without hesitation, I bluntly agreed with her. You are horrible people, I said. All of you. And if there's any justice in the world, you'll go to hell for it. I wasn't exaggerating. They were awful, and they knew it. But if I'd ever brought this up in private, they would have just gotten mad, twisted things around, and acted like I was the problem. They'd buried themselves so deep in denial over the years that it had become part of who they were. At that point, my mother buried her face in my father's jacket, sobbing, while he looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me entirely, silently finishing up the job of loading their belongings back into the moving truck. I kept a close eye on everything to make sure nothing of mine went missing, though I didn't have much furniture yet for them to even try. Once everything was packed, they all got in their vehicles. Sil stayed behind a moment longer, glaring at me with pure malice, but eventually my brother got her to leave, and she drove their minivan home. As soon as they were gone, I jumped online and shared the entire story with my family. This time, my parents were too humiliated to even try defending their actions. While the family had been somewhat divided before this incident, the fallout turned the tide completely in my favor. Almost everyone sided with me after hearing what happened. Even the few relatives who didn't pick a side stopped supporting my parents. No matter how many times they tried using the "we did it for Dan" excuse, no one was listening anymore. Whatever support they'd had left was gone for good. A lot of the family members I thought might side against me actually ended up supporting me, including some of the former flying monkeys. I guess even they had finally had enough of my parents and Dan's antics. Around that time, I decided to host a Christmas Eve gathering at my new house and invited half the family. My parents, Dan, and Sil were not on the guest list. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on Dan and Sil's social media profiles, so I saw that Sil had her fourth baby in early November. They were still living with my parents, and I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because every couple of weeks, Sil would make some passive-aggressive post about how cramped and frustrating it was to live at my parents' house. I couldn't help but laugh, imagining how much it was driving my mom and dad crazy. 3 rowdy kids, a mentally unstable Sil, the golden child Dan, and now a newborn, all under one roof. They must have been losing their minds trying to keep up. Maybe they should take a page out of their own book, move into a camper in the backyard, and let Dan have their house instead. That way, they could finally have some peace. After all, they could do it for Dan, right? Now, some people have told me I should have just had my brother and Sil arrested. The only reason I didn't was because of their kids. If Dan got arrested, he'd probably lose his job, and without his income, that family wouldn't have any money. Sil just had a newborn, and while I wasn't about to sacrifice my life for their mistakes, I didn't want to completely ruin those kids' lives either. That said, you don't need jail time to get revenge. Sure, the police were helpful, but I got plenty of payback without filing any charges. Would I be this merciful again? Probably not, and Dan and Sil know it. I decided to hold off on making an account and posting an update until after the new year, just in case something else happened. And of course it did. As I mentioned earlier, Sil had been posting the same tired complaints on social media ever since she had her baby in November. She'd mix up the wording, but the message was always the same. She was tired of living with my parents. There wasn't enough space. She needed her own house and on and on. By that point, I was so done with their drama that I couldn't help but roll my eyes at every post. After everything they'd put me through, I was well past the point of sympathy. If I could have played a tiny violin in front of her, I probably would have. When January rolled around, I finally felt ready to share an update. As expected, more had happened in the meantime, but first, let me talk about the Christmas Eve party. Everyone I invited made the trip, even though it was a 3 to 4 hour drive for most of them. They wanted to show their support, and the turnout was amazing. They praised me for how hard I'd worked to buy my house on my own and expressed regret for everything I'd been through. Some family members asked why I hadn't just taken my camper and driven the 3 hours back to my hometown instead of living borderline homeless for so long. I had to admit, a little sheepishly, that I was really attached to living in this area. The job opportunities here were far better for my field, and honestly, my hometown didn't have much to offer career-wise, if anything at all. I also wanted to carve out my own path and make my way without relying on anyone else. That answer seemed to satisfy them, and we moved on. The party itself was amazing, easily the best I'd been to in years. Some of my relatives even brought CDs of classic Christmas albums to play. My uncle brought one with Ray Charles's holiday songs, and I have to say, it was my favorite. Nobody sings Christmas songs quite like Ray Charles. For once, I felt like I could set aside all my past issues and just enjoy the moment. The atmosphere was joyful, and everyone was happy. But of course, things couldn't stay that way. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up. My parents, Dan, and Sil. They walked right into my house without even knocking, trying to look all cheerful and unbothered, like they were supposed to be there. I immediately shut off the music and told them to leave. They started begging to stay, claiming they'd brought gifts, but before I could say another word, one of my uncles stood up and laid into them. He shouted that they had no right to be in my home or my life after what they tried to pull months ago, and several other relatives chimed in to back him up. The best part? This uncle is my mom's brother, and he used to adore her. But after learning about everything that went on between me and my parents, his opinion of her had clearly changed. Even my grandparents, as old and frail as they are, didn't hesitate to get involved. They told my parents that if they truly wanted to make amends with me, it was far too soon for that. They went on to say that they'd never been more disappointed in my parents than they were this past year. My grandparents had always done their best to keep their heads down when it came to my parents' blatant favoritism toward Dan. But now, the truth was out, and nobody was fooled anymore. They told my parents that if they ever wanted to be part of my life again, they'd have to make a serious effort to treat me like a son instead of an afterthought. Then they turned to Dan and Sil and said they were tired of the repetitive nonsense Sil kept posting on social media. They told her it was time to let it go and move on already. I made it clear to everyone. My house would never become their new home. Sil, predictably, reverted to her usual routine of crying and throwing a pity party. She flopped into a chair, wailing about how unfair it was that I got to have this house all to myself when I didn't even have a family, while she had 4 kids who desperately needed more space. She went on about how she just wanted a better place to live so she could feel like a real mom. I'll admit, I was feeling petty, so I loudly pointed out that she wasn't exactly a model mother. I told her she leaves most of the parenting to my mom while she lounges around all day, drinking, playing on her phone, or blowing through Dan's money on frivolous things. Yet she has the audacity to complain about her situation. I even joked that I was surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk, given how much booze she consumed. That one might have been a bit too much, as I definitely got some stares. Sil, of course, demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I shot back. The evidence speaks for itself. I told her that if she ever wanted to move out of my parents' house, she should dust off her college degree, get a job, and start saving money. Since my mom already handles most of the childcare, Sil would have plenty of time to work once the baby was a bit older. At that moment, my brother's eldest, his 7-year-old, ran up to me, kicking and screaming, defending his mom. He yelled that she said I was the bad guy who made her cry and wouldn't let them live in my house. Before things could escalate further, Dan grabbed his son and pulled him away. That's when the other relatives jumped in, and the situation turned into a full-blown family intervention aimed squarely at Sil and Dan. Sil was sobbing, her baby was crying, and the other kids were wailing too. Even Dan looked like he was on the verge of tears. He sat on the ottoman near the front door, hunched over, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He didn't even try to defend himself, not with a house full of angry relatives ready to tear him apart if he played the golden child card again. If it hadn't been for the other family members stepping in, I'm certain Dan would have tried pulling the same entitled nonsense he had months earlier when he demanded my house. But this time, his humiliation was complete. His reputation, and my parents', was in tatters. The masks were off, and everyone finally saw them for who they truly were. After they left in defeat, the party picked up where it left off. No one wanted to talk about what had just happened, so we let it go for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night at my house. I even let a few relatives crash in the camper to make sure there was enough room. They were fascinated by the camper, saying they couldn't believe I'd lived in it for nearly 2 years. I got a lot of questions about how I managed during the summers and winters, and I didn't mind answering them. It made for lighthearted conversation after all the drama. The next morning, I was up earlier than everyone else. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and had ibuprofen ready for those battling spiked eggnog hangovers. My relatives complimented me on being a far better host than my parents had ever been, and we all agreed to do it again next Christmas. After the holidays, something surprising happened. Sil finally stopped posting her passive-aggressive nonsense on social media. Sil eventually stopped posting her passive-aggressive digs at me and even deleted all the old ones. However, not long after the new year, she made a new post whining about how she tried to convince my parents to buy a camper like mine so they could set it up in their backyard. Her brilliant plan was that Dan and his family would take over the entire house as their own. Let's just say the idea didn't go over well. My parents turned it down flat, and I heard through the grapevine that they were absolutely adamant about it. There was no way they were giving up their home, let alone their master bedroom, to anyone, not even their precious golden child. That post didn't stay up long. Sil took it down after a couple of days, and she's barely posted anything since. I guess she's finally realized there's no point in complaining when no one's listening anymore. As for Dan, he can't afford to move his family out of my parents' house on his salary alone, and I wouldn't be surprised if they ended up having yet another kid in the next few years. Since then, things have quieted down for me. I even hosted a poker night with some friends recently. I'll admit, I'm terrible at poker. I can never remember the rules, but it didn't matter. It was all about hanging out, drinking beer, eating junk food, and being a bunch of happy, overgrown idiots. We loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and just had the best kind of night. Unfiltered, unadulterated fun where you don't take life too seriously and maybe get a little too drunk. Looking ahead, I'm thinking about dipping my toes back into dating this summer. I'm not getting any younger, and it's about time I gave it a shot. Fingers crossed it goes well. As for the camper, it just sits idle in my yard now. Sometimes, I go out there to spend time in it. After living in it for 2 years, it feels like my second home. One day, I'd like to actually use it for camping, the way it was meant to be used. I've never been camping before. My parents always thought it was a waste of time, so it'd be a completely new experience for me.